I've noticed over the last few years that vegetarianism has become quite common, especially amongst young people. You might have some of your grandchildren perhaps who have decided to take on this lifestyle. Sometimes it comes from an ethical place, thinking that rights for animals and that cruelty for animals shouldn't be. Well, it's terrible that animals are treated badly in abattoirs and other places, so they decide not to eat meat at all. At St Paul's time, in the first reading today, we get an insight into some of the food issues that were happening in Corinth. And St Paul writes about this in great detail today. And he tells us a little piece of trivia at the very end of this reading today, that St Paul decided he would become a vegetarian. And he doesn't become a vegetarian because he's talking about the rights of the animals, that animals are more important than humans. He's talking about the fact that he becomes a vegetarian because he thinks it's prudent. And it's very interesting that at St Paul's time you had the pagan religions, and many of the pagan religions would sacrifice animals to the gods, and then they would then eat the food that had been sacrificed to those other gods. And in places that we had a large number of pagan communities, you would go to the local butcher and you wouldn't necessarily know what had been sacrificed to the gods or these other pagan gods and what had just been prepared for food to be sold. And this was creating great tension amongst the Christian community. Should they eat the food that had been sacrificed to other gods? And St Paul gives us this great detailed explanation in this reading today, saying, well, even if these other gods existed, which we don't say that, we're not claiming that they do exist, but we think that the other people who've been sacrificing these animals, they think they are sacrificing them to these gods. So even in that's blasphemous. He said, even if we deny and we recognise the fact that these gods don't exist, he thinks it's prudent in this context not to be eating the food that had been sacrificed to other gods, which is quite interesting. I think the main takeaway from this reading today I get is the importance of prudence. That any action that we do, we need to consider how will that impact others, especially if we are in positions of leadership. Are we prudent? Are we being an example for others to follow in a negative way? Or are we being overly careful to make sure that we are prudent in our own lives and we are giving an example that builds others up on the way in the journey of Jesus Christ? St Paul decides to then become a vegetarian because he thinks it's the prudent path. The path that clearly says, I'm not eating something that could have been tainted by worship and sacrifice to the pagan gods. And so he says, I won't eat meat, which is very interesting. He doesn't say eating meat's a bad thing. He just says eating meat that could have been sacrificed to another god previously, that's not a good thing. Let us be prudent in our own actions, not just in what we eat, but in everything that we do, that we be a witness, that we be example to others of the life of Jesus Christ.